Hi, my name is Emily Patterson. I'm a learning designer for Cambridge Online Education, home of Cambridge Advanced Online and the course Creativity, Problem Solving, and Design Thinking. And I'm joined today by the academic on that course, Nathan Crilly. Hi, Nathan. Thanks for being here with us.
Thanks, Emily. So I am the professor of design in the engineering department at the University of Cambridge and developed the course with you and others from Cambridge Online Education a few years ago. And it's been running ever since. So it's run for about 4 years.
And we're going to talk a little bit today about the course, particularly because recently the course won a Learning Technologies Award, Gold Award for Best Use of Social and Collaborative Learning. So we'll make sure we highlight that throughout our conversation. But first, Nathan, tell us more about the course and tell us why it was important to you to create this course.
Thanks. So I've been researching design and creativity, invention, sort of processes like that for over 20 years. And that's involved a range of different methods, sometimes visiting expert designers, studying them, studying how they work, or running experiments on more novice designers and trying to understand what improves or compromises their creativity. And there's a lot of research that we've conducted, but also that other people have that can usefully be built into training that is geared at a much more general audience. So not design professionals necessarily, but anyone who's interested in being more creative or more innovative in how they address problems, especially problems in their work. So that was the original impetus for the course, and I think characterizes the way in which it was built. So quite a research-led approach and trying to provide a wide range of learners with the skills they need to make progress in their own lives and in their own work projects.
But the framing of the course is rather unique, isn't it? Because you don't start out with here's the creative process, here's how to make it better, right? There are other approaches that you go through first.
Yeah, that's right. So the course actually doesn't start with creativity at all and steps back and looks at the different ways in which any of us can think, the different thinking skills that we can exploit. And those might be things like thinking visually or thinking verbally, could be inductive or deductive logic. We looked at lots of different ways in which people can express their thinking. We also look at lots of different ways in which that thinking can become compromised. So that could be a range of cognitive biases or limitations that might prevent people from thinking widely and instead narrow their thinking to maybe what's quite common or what's quite usual. Shall we start off with that very broad basis of looking at different ways of thinking and different ways of getting stuck? And then we tend to explain the creative process and different creative tools through that lens, that each of those processes or tools is typically trying to allow people to move more freely across the different range or across the different ways of thinking available to them. And also those tools are structured to prevent people becoming blocked or blinkered and only thinking about things in a limited way. So that's how the course starts. And then we move on and look at things like design thinking, visual thinking, systems thinking, these more aggregated approaches that are quite popular and quite widely known and understood. So having set up basics of thinking and getting stuck, having looked at some aggregated approaches that can be useful, we use that all the way through the course to work through a creative process, have the learners work on problems that are specific to their individual industry or the role that they're performing. Yeah, so that's how the course is framed.
Yeah, and what you just said at the end, having the different learners working from all different backgrounds and industries through this particular same process. How do you find that the different backgrounds of the learners contribute to kind of the dynamic learning environment of the course? How much are they able to take from, one person coming from an engineering background, whereas another person is coming from quite a more, perhaps a writing background or a research background or a quote unquote creative industries background? Because you've had all sorts on the course, haven't you?
Yeah, so the course has drawn in people from a very wide range of sectors, management consultancy, healthcare, standard business development, innovation, education, etc. Um, no particular industry or sector jumps out as being one that we haven't seen on the course so far. And I think really using that diversity and having the learners work with each other and learn from each other is something I picked up from you during the learning design process, that we're not just trying to deliver content that each individual absorbs and becomes more proficient in, we're trying to actually draw out the experiences and perspectives that those different learners have already developed and have them trade that between each other. And then when they apply the tools that we're providing, then the learners can also see how different people apply those tools in different settings. So all the way through the course, the learners are learning from each other, as well as from the academic content that's been provided or the industry perspectives that we bring in. Yeah, so that sort of peer learning or social learning is definitely a large part of how the course was developed with you and how it's been implemented since then.
Right. So, at Cambridge Advance Online, we know that research tells us that within a peer cohort, peers learn as much from each other as they do from the expert in the room. I'm not sure that if they would report that, but we do know that it takes place. So we use a lot of social technologies, particularly in this course. Discussion boards is one of the most prominent. It's a really typical kind of social technology to use, but I think we've used it in really unique ways. The graphic elicitation exercise is my favorite example of discussion forums within the course and a discussion assignment that isn't sort of your typical, here's a prompt, type your answer, respond to one another. So could you explain the graphic elicitation exercise, what that is? Most people probably won't be familiar with that technique.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So we have discussion fora on the course and the learners engage with those, but we often try to use those discussion boards in a quite a visual way rather than just having it be a verbal exchange. So one of the activities, the one you're referring to, actually as a sort of warm-up activity for visual thinking, sends the learners out and they have to interview someone in their workplace or their family or one of their friends. And that interview they're conducting, they're trying to understand, let's say it's a friend, they're trying to understand that friend's experience of a recent activity. Maybe they've just applied for and successfully got a new job, or they've just run a marathon, or they've just come back from holiday. So one of our learners would interview that friend and they would map out visually what the experience was like over time. So we sometimes just call it a happiness graph. The vertical axis represents how happy or unhappy they were, typically with happy at the top and unhappy at the bottom. And then the horizontal axis is the time axis. And during the interview, the learner is not just trying to get some words or quotes out of the person they're speaking to, but actually get them to draw out this experience over time. When did it go up in happiness or satisfaction, and when did it go down? It's quite a basic form of user journey or customer journey. And then they can use that visual representation to help drive the discussion further. Why was it so low at that point? Or what was it like for things to get so much better so quickly after a certain moment? Then they post those graphs that they've drawn with their participants back onto the discussion board, and then they can interact with each other about what they learned, what they found difficult, how they might apply that kind of technique in their own work, perhaps to track their customers' satisfaction, but it also could be their employees or their team members. We've had them use it, for example, to map out on a team away day, how do people actually experience the run up to that event, the event itself, and afterwards. So sometimes people are applying these tools very quickly in their workplace rather than just something that gets applied later on.
And do you find that most people are pretty good about responding to each other? Because I think we've all been on courses where there's a discussion assignment, everybody posts their assignment, nobody actually responds. So there isn't actually any peer interaction going on. Do you find that discussion boards are quite active in the course?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a board where people are posting and no one's responding. So the tutors that support the course partly encourage that with announcements, but I think mostly through their own sort of demonstration of what that would look like. So they engage with certain posts. They might connect 2 or 3 learners' posts together and explain what is maybe similar or contrasting in those. But we find the learners in any case are quite engaged in the activities and therefore engaged with what other learners are doing and the different way that they've applied that. So just with that graphic elicitation exercise or the happiness graphing, it might be that one learner has done it with their maybe with their son who's just gone to school for the day and reports back on that. And often they're finding out things that they didn't get when they just had a discussion about how was your day at school. So the experience of getting a richer picture of one thing is often contrasted with what someone else did in a different setting. So through all the discussion boards, then there's really high levels of engagement, not just with the activity, but also with each other's experience of that.
I wonder what a happiness graph of a learner on the course would look like. That would be a
Yeah,
fun
we should do
exercise.
that. That would be a good discussion board to add in, that we could have them graph across the 6 modules, what were the high and low points, and maybe even have them make recommendations or discuss with each other, especially where the graphs diverge. And that can be where it's interesting. Why did one person find one module more interesting or more engaging than someone else did? Yeah, good idea.
So I do love the innovation that we came up with on some of the discussion forums, but we recently refreshed the course, and one of the things, because of course we can't just have a creative course, we have to have, or a course about creativity, but rather that course needs to be creative in its design. Um, the way that we revamped the module 6 exercise from moving from a whiteboarding exercise to a social annotation document annotation exercise. So the hypothesis exercise where people interview each other. I think that's a really interesting use case. So hypothesis is a document annotation tool. You can upload a PDF into the learning environment and people can comment on it. And those comments become discussion forums in and of themselves. Can you talk a little bit more about the exercise, the setup that we originally had and why we needed to change it?
Yeah, so initially in the final module of the course, module 6, so at this point, the learners are typically 5 or 6 weeks into the course. And we had an activity where we were interested not just in having our learners become more confident in their creativity or become more capable in developing and applying creative tools. We also wanted to have them be more articulate in topics related to creativity. So could they represent their own creative abilities if they were, for example, posting something on LinkedIn or some other platform? Or could they write a job description for someone they needed to hire and make sure that that job description adequately represented the creative or innovative capacities that they required? So one of the activities we used to have just in one module was that people would go into a whiteboarding tool, they would post their CV, then other learners would go in and highlight certain bits of the CV and add a sticky asking a question about that, asking the learner to elaborate on something. And then the learners whose CV it was would respond in kind. So it was a little bit like an asynchronous visual interview about creativity. One of the problems we found was that initially when we implemented this all in one module at the end of the course, learners were in any case, 6 weeks into the course, they had other aspects of their lives they were trying to catch back up with. And there wasn't really time within one module or 1 week for them to post their CV, ask a question, answer another question. And often there'd be quite a bit of engagement, so they'd have lots of questions to answer. And it was a bit crammed in that last module. So we switched from a whiteboarding tool to the hypothesis annotation tool. We provided some elements of a sort of generic job description that emphasized certain aspects of creative skills, including things like systems thinking or prototyping techniques. And we post that now, not in module 6, but in module 4. And then in module 4, they engage with that and they ask each other questions to try and elicit more information about what people bring with respect to those skills. Then in module 5, they go back and answer those questions. And then in module 6, they go back to it again and engage with those answers and suggest possible improvements in how it could be articulated. So we now use 3 of the modules rather than just one. We use this different platform of annotation, which controls the interaction in a way that's quite useful in terms of some discipline of where the information appears, so that over the course of those few weeks, people can still find the questions that they're asking each other and the answers that are being given. So it works much better now. It's much less time compressed. The platform works better in that way. And the learners get more time to think about things from week to week, how they would really answer that question, or what good example from their professional practice can they use to illustrate a certain skill that maybe they've never articulated before because they've been focused on a subset of skills rather than these more creative ones.
Yeah. So would you say that learner engagement with that particular exercise has gone up since we switched out the technologies and the approach?
Yeah, it's gone up a lot. I mean, often what we'd find was in the first implementation, before we iterated it, we'd have a high level of engagement from a small number of learners because they would typically be the ones who got to the module first and were maybe loading the work into the beginning of their week. They're the ones who'd have time to engage with it, post a question, get to the responses. People arriving into that module later in the week, because there's flexibility to accommodate people's schedules, but people arriving later in the week, they would find a board already covered in questions. It'd be quite maybe overwhelming to see all this stuff already there. Then they'd be finding a place that they could still contribute. Whereas now, because we spread it across multiple weeks and because of the structure set up by hypothesis, we've got a more accessible and more, I'd say, sort of fair way of allowing people to engage, irrespective of the time in the week that they have devoted to the course.
Excellent. Glad to hear it's working. Always nice when an activity works the way you designed it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for working
So
with me on the redesign. So it's made a big difference.
excellent. So we talked about how the whiteboarding tool wasn't actually a fit use case for that particular activity, but we use a whiteboarding tool quite a lot throughout the course. What's an activity that we do in the course where the efficacy of the whiteboarding tool really stands out as sort of a social collaborative learning space?
Yeah, so as you say, we use quite a few whiteboards as we go through the 6 weeks, and sometimes they're individual activities, and that it's useful to do that early on because it gets people warmed up to the tool if they haven't used digital whiteboarding before. We also do small group activities, but I think the one that stands out is an analogical thinking activity that we do in module 4, so 4 weeks in, and that's all the learners together on live session. So we do one live session per week so people can interact face to face with me and the tutor and each other, of course. And we use that whiteboard live in that session so that everyone can be posting ideas at the same time. So they do a bit of pre-work before the session typically, and they gather their thoughts about the challenge we're working on. And then the first part of the activity is that people just generate analogies. So we work on a particular challenge. And if, for example, the challenge we were working on was how could we improve, let's say, improve revenue for a roller coaster ride. Maybe we're responsible for that roller coaster and want to improve its financial performance. What would it mean to think about our job as something other than roller coasters? So maybe it's a bit like running a restaurant where you're trying to provide a service to people, or maybe it's like running a cinema or a movie theater where people want to turn up and be entertained. And by thinking about the roller coaster by analogy and looking at it in these different ways, we can draw different points of inspiration from those other areas. So maybe when we think about it as being a bit like a restaurant, we might think about menus, or we might think about starters and main courses rather than just one thing. We might then imagine how could we apply that back to our roller coaster example. Maybe we need a set of different options we provide. Or maybe more usefully, we think about it a bit more like a cinema, and we think about things like trailers and advertisements and selling popcorn. And maybe there's a way when we have our queue for the roller coaster that we can extract some financial benefit from providing those queuing with some snacks or other entertainment. So that would be an example of analogical thinking. And in the beginning of the activity, we actually work on an environmental problem, but it's a bit more complicated to explain. But what we would do is, first of all, just generate the analogies. So someone would come saying, oh, I think it's a bit like a restaurant. Someone else comes along and says they think it's a bit like cinema. And various other analogies would be drawn out. So the group, first of all, just generating analogies for how they could think about the problem rather than thinking about solutions to the problem. And then in the second part, we take a quick vote. People vote for the analogies that they think are going to be fun to work with and productive for solving the problem. And then the group move into this solution generation phase. And first of all, we pick one analogy and everyone generates solutions using that, using the sticky notes on the digital whiteboarding tool. And then in the second part, we go to a different analogy, typically one that's very different to the first one. And then they generate analogies about that. So all the way through that live session, people are posting stickies on the whiteboard. They're commenting on other people's stickies. They're voting on the stickies they like the sound of. Sometimes we have people who are participating, and for that week, they might be commuting or traveling, and maybe they're not on their laptop, but they might be dropping ideas into the chat, and then those ideas get transferred over to the board so everyone can see it. And all the way through that activity, I'm actually reading things out loud. So again, those who maybe temporarily aren't looking at a screen can still get a sense as to the ideas that are being generated. So it's quite multimodal, even though we're using a whiteboard. And then at the end, those who haven't been able to make that live session, perhaps because they were unavailable that week, they can often go into the board and using different color stickies, they start adding their ideas. So over the course of the week, it continues to develop. It's not just during the live call that we have with the learners. Yeah, that's a quick summary of how that activity works.
And that's one that you've told me. I know when we first designed the course, I could not wrap my head around this analogical thinking thing. And I was still would say I'm not particularly expert at it, but that's an activity you've told me that learners who do struggle with analogical thinking, it really brings it to life for them, seeing other people's ideas and how other people reach for analogies.
Yeah, actually, maybe you should jump on the call. It's in 4 weeks' time, and you can participate in the activity, and then you won't be able to say it's not quite clear or that you haven't done it before. So yeah, we see a lot of variation in how natural people find analogical thinking. I think that's a general observation, and it applies to lots of the things we cover in the course. I mean, earlier you mentioned, let's say, people from the creative industries versus people from the technology sector. And so we see a lot of variation in people who are more inclined towards intuitive methods, those who are more inclined towards structured methods. And analogical thinking maybe just makes that a bit clearer. There are some people who say, for example, during that activity, oh, I've noticed my colleagues or I've noticed my partner or other people doing this all the time. I didn't really know what they were doing, but they're always comparing things to other things. And they're always saying, maybe that's a bit like this other thing that sounds very different. And I now realize that what they're doing is this analogical connection, and they're drawing, inspiration across from different areas. Or we find people who are really good at generating the analogies, but they find it harder to then generate solutions from those analogies. Or people for whom that's the opposite altogether, and they find it very hard to come up with the original analogical comparison. But once someone has made that comparison, they're greater than generating ideas from that. So that's one of the areas in which we see quite a bit of diversity. And therefore, as a group working together, they can recognize better what each person brings. And if, for example, they were a team working together in their actual business, they could recognize it's good to have someone that can generate analogies and someone who can work with them. Some people think about things very concretely rather than analogically, and that's useful as well. And then increasingly, of course, we bring in AI tools, and you can prompt AI systems to help you with analogical reasoning. You can ask it for what would be a broad range of analogies that would be similar to the thing you're working on. And we give examples of what AI would do in that case, but also people can use that in their own activities when they're applying it to their business later on.
Well, Nathan, I appreciate we're running out of time, and there's a lot of other instances of social technologies we could talk about, whether your innovative use of Zoom filters to assume different personas, or the activity in the alumni group on LinkedIn. But I hope that everybody's really enjoyed learning more about the really, dare I say, creative and innovative uses of social learning on this course. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk.
Well, thanks a lot for the discussion and for all the stimulating questions. But also thanks to you and the wider team for co-developing the course and then also running it from there on. Yeah.
And if you'd like to learn more about the course, then you can always visit our website. Just Google Cambridge Advance Online. Thanks so much, everyone.